Hi guys, today we're going to be looking at how government and trade worked in the 13 colonies. Here are your video goals. Government in the 13 colonies was determined primarily by the charter of that colony. Every colony had a charter, and the charter was basically an agreement between that colony and the King of England. And the charter is usually laid out basic rules of the colony and also the purposes of the colony, and established that the colony promised to be loyal to the king. One famous example of a charter that we've already seen is the Mayflower Compact. And the Mayflower Compact is basically running along the same lines, where they're promising to be loyal to the king, and they're talking about how they are there to advance religion. And then they also set up some rules for self-government. And these are the three different pillars of the Plymouth colony. All the other colonies that we've looked at also have similar charters that basically lay out the same types of things. What they're doing, why they're there, how they're going to do it, and they're loyal to the king. So after a colony got set up, the colony would have a government that was made up of a legislature and a governor. And both of these were important for running the government of the colony. The legislature's main job was to write and vote on laws. And so these guys were groups of people, groups of men, who were elected by other men in the colony. And not every man was allowed to vote, and of course women weren't allowed to vote at all. But only the land-owning males of the colony were allowed to vote. So this meant that basically the richer people in the colony got a say. If you didn't own any land, then you didn't get to vote. There's a really famous example of this. It's Virginia's House of Burgesses, which you see pictured there. This was the very first colonial legislature set up in the early 1600s. The other side of colonial government, besides the legislature, were the governors. So the governors actually had a lot of the real power. Even though the legislature voted on the laws and wrote the laws, the governor was the one who was allowed to enforce the laws, or maybe not enforce the laws. And the governors were all directly responsible to the English king. So whatever the king wanted, the governors would basically do. So even though the legislatures seem really important and seem like they're pretty powerful, a lot of the real power rests in the hands of the governors, and therefore in the hands of the English king. Now let's turn to look at how the economy of the 13 colonies worked. The economy of the 13 colonies was dependent on trade. If it wasn't for trade, the colonies would not have been able to succeed. And trade was important for a number of reasons. One is that many people in the colonies worked to produce exports. That is to say, their main job was to make stuff that would get shipped out to other countries. That's what an export is, by the way. Something that is produced in one country and shipped out to another country. And examples, we've already talked about this, but examples of this would be cash crops like tobacco, timber, or also fish. So a lot of people's jobs depended on making a bunch of this stuff, more than the colonists needed for themselves, and shipping it out to other countries. On top of this, almost everybody in the colonies depended on British imports. This is stuff like tea, sugar, cloth, guns, and tools. This was stuff that was really hard to get in the Americas. For example, it's impossible to grow tea in the United States. And it's really hard to grow sugar here too, except in the very deep south. So these were things that they could only get by trading with the British. And so basically how the economy worked was that the colonists would make stuff to sell to other countries, and then with that profit they made from selling stuff to other countries bring in the stuff they needed. So this is all complicated by the fact that mercantilist ideas lead Britain to pass the Navigation Acts in the 1650s. So remember, mercantilism is when a country tries to regulate trade in order to get as much money as possible. And the thinking here was that if the British wanted to make it so that the 13 colonies could only trade with Britain, and that way Britain would get all of the stuff that the colonies produced, and they would get to sell all the stuff they made to the colonists. So the idea was that it would increase the amount of money that Britain could get out of the colonies. And the main thing that happened with the Navigation Acts was they restricted the economic freedom of the colonists. And the two big things here is they basically forced the colonists to sell the stuff they make to British traders, who then take it back to England. And they prevent colonists from buying stuff from other countries. So there were other countries that could bring sugar and cloth and tea to the colonies. But because of the navigation laws, it was illegal to buy this stuff. They were only allowed to buy sugar and tea and cloth and guns from British merchants. And all of this combines to make life a lot harder for the colonists, because it's harder to get the stuff they need, and it's harder to sell all the stuff they make. So it's harder to make a living. And this, of course, is not cool with the colonists. And the colonists, in order to fix the problem, begin smuggling on a very large scale. Smuggling, of course, is when you move goods illegally. The word is often used today with the international drug trade, with people moving illegal substances back and forth across the border. This is essentially the same thing as what was happening in the 13 colonies, except instead of moving illegal drugs, they were just moving illegal stuff. Tea, sugar, cloth, all this stuff was illegal to bring into the country unless you were a British merchant. So they would load up ships secretly in the dark and sail into harbors and unload all this illegal stuff and sell it. Basically to meet the demand of the colonists. So smuggling is very important because it increases the options that the colonists have for what they want to buy and sell. So as you can probably see at this point, the British had a lot of control over the colonists. They basically controlled the colonial governments through the governors, who were loyal to the king, and they controlled trade by introducing the Navigation Acts. And if they had wanted to, the British could have been real jerks, and they could have basically forced the colonists to do whatever they wanted, and forced the colonists only ever to trade with the British. But they decide not to do that. And that's because they adopt a policy known as Salutary Neglect. And so basically from 1650 to 1750, the British decide to let the colonists do whatever they want. So even though the British have the power to control the colonists, they choose not to. And so why do the British choose not to use all their power and to let the colonists do their thing? The British give a couple reasons for this. They think that leaving the colonists alone will keep them happy, because then they can just do whatever they need. They think it will allow the colonists to grow faster. And they think because of this that it will result in more money for Britain in the long run. So even though they won't get as much trade right away, because they're not enforcing the Navigation Acts, in the long run they will make more money because they will have happier, bigger colonies. And so basically what this means is, as a result of salutary neglect, the colonial governors don't really challenge the authority of the locally elected legislatures. And the British don't really enforce the Navigation Acts. So even though it's technically illegal to trade with other countries, they just let it happen and don't make a big deal about it. And so smuggling goes unchecked. And there's lots of stuff coming into the colonies from all sorts of different countries. And as a result of salutary neglect, life is pretty easy for the colonists, or at least easier, and the British don't make quite as much money in the short term, but the colonies are able to grow quickly. And most historians agree that this policy of salutary neglect was a good idea. Basically, it helped the colonies to grow, and it kept them happy, and this was much more important than squeezing out a little bit of extra money in the short term. Alright, thanks for watching. Here are your video goals. See you all tomorrow.